Okay, we're live and I'm going to let everyone in right now. Just let me know when to take the slide down.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to start in just a moment. Please bear with us. All right, let's do it. Hello, everyone. My name is Joel Whitney from Brooklyn Public Library's BPL Presents, and it's a pleasure to see you tonight for this talk around Suzanne Schneider's The Apocalypse and the End of History with Suzanne. Will be discussing ideas in her book with Spencer Ackerman and Asad, Dandia. 20 years after September 11th, Suzanne Schneider discusses how the political violence of modern jihad echoes the crises of Western liberalism. This event is co-presented with the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and books are on sale, courtesy of Greenlight Bookstore. A link will be dropped into the chat in a moment. And before we start, I just wanted to let you know that this Wednesday we present David Wengrow and the late David Graeber. Their book, Dawn of Everything, A New History of Mankind, will be presented. Wengrow will be in conversation with Astor Taylor, Stephanie Kelton. Those three will be in person, and Sylvia Federici will be on Zoom. And for those of you who RSVP'd, you can come. We're trying to do in-person programming, toe in the water style. As many of you know, you can find our events calendar at bklynlibrary.org/bplpresents. And the BPL Presents handle is what we use on social media too. Speaking of which, we'll be streaming this to Facebook, as you see, and we'll drop all those links in the chat here so you can follow us. Now, for tonight, in this authoritative, accessible study, historian Suzanne Schneider looks at the politics and ideology of the Islamic State, better known as ISIS. Beginning with a short talk and a discussion followed by your questions, Schneider argues that today's jihad is not residue from a less enlightened time, nor does it have much in common with its classical or medieval form, but it does bear a striking resemblance to the reactionary political formations and acts of spectacular violence that are upending life in Western democracies. From authoritarian populism to mass shootings, xenophobic nationalism, and the allure of conspiratorial thinking, Schneider argues that modern jihad is not the antithesis to Western neoliberalism, but rather a dark reflection of its inner logic. She writes, figures like Sam Harris, Bill Maher, Frank Gaffney, and Laura Ingraham unfortunately command more airtime than scholars such as Suleiman Murad, Roxanne Ayubin, or Khaled Abu al-Fadl, and they use it to perpetuate the view that there is a fundamental link between Islam and violence. According to this view, the 7th century Islamic conquest of much of the Middle East and North Africa inaugurated a continuous history of jihad that culminated in the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and those that have occurred since. For partisans of this view, violence within Islam is both essential, you can't escape it without abandoning Islam, and eternal, it is a consistent rather than exceptional state of affairs. Casting aside, quote, apologists who contest this narrative, these pundits assert their prerogative to adjudicate what Islam is really about, namely jihad, the purpose of which is supposedly to spread the faith by force. The problem is not that this argument lacks nuance or misses out on finer points evident only to academic specialists. It is that it is historically verifiably false. And stop. Suzanne Schneider will be in conversation with two wonderful thinkers and writers. Spencer Ackerman is a journalist and author of Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. Ackerman has been a national security correspondent for outlets like The New Republic, Wired, The Guardian, and The Daily Beast for nearly the entire war on terror. He has reported from the front lines of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Guantanamo Bay. He shared in the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism for Edward Snowden's NSA leaks to The Guardian, a series of stories that also yielded him other awards, including the Scripps Howard Foundation's 2014 Roy W. Howard Award for Public Service Reporting, and the 2013 IRE Medal for Investigative Reporting. Ackerman's Wired series on Islamophobic counterterrorism training at the FBI won the 2012 Online National Magazine Award for reporting. Ackerman is the publisher of the Forever Wars newsletter on Substack, where he tracks the ongoing course of the war on terror. He lives in his native Brooklyn with his wife and children. Welcome. Asad Dandia is a Brooklyn-born writer, organizer, and grad student. As an undergraduate, he was a co-founder of the mutual aid organization Muslims Giving Back, which was targeted by NYPD informants, pushing Asad to join historic Raza versus City of New York lawsuit as a plaintiff to challenge the NYPD's anti-Muslim surveillance, propelling him into advocacy and organizing. He writes on politics, culture, and religion, and has worked locally for Muslim Community Network, the Cordoba House, and currently teaches at the Islamic Learning Center of New York City. He's a co-host of New Books and Middle East Studies podcast at the New Books Network, and a book reviewer for Publishers Weekly's Middle East and Islam sections. He holds an MA in Islamic Studies from Columbia University and is currently an MA student in Urban Studies with a focus on the urban workforce at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. A Brooklyn native and nationalist, he is passionate about his city's history, culture, and politics, and is studying for his NYC tour guide license so he can further spread the gospel of Gotham. And finally, Suzanne Schneider is Deputy Director and core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, specializing in the political and social history of the modern Middle East. Her books include Mandatory Separation, Religion, Education, and Mass Politics in Palestine, 2018, and The Apocalypse and the End of History, Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism, out from Verso this fall. Her writing about political violence, religion, militancy, and American foreign policy has appeared in the Washington Post, N+1 Foreign Policy, Religion Dispatches, Mother Jones, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other publications. Please welcome Suzanne, Spencer, and Asad.
Thank you so much, Joel. Should I just go on right in? Okay. Sorry, pardon my cough. Thank you. Hello, good evening. Thank you so much to Brooklyn Public Library for organizing this conversation, Joel for that lovely introduction, and most of all to Asad and Spencer for being part of this discussion tonight. So it's going to be pretty unstructured, but I'm going to kick us off with a few words about why I wrote this book and the argument that it advances. So it's just over 20 years ago that the attacks of 9/11 made jihad a household term in the US. And I want to acknowledge that this was an utterly strange and unfamiliar thing to so many of us. And I think particularly surreal to be experienced by people my age who had grown up in the 90s during this time of seemingly like peace and prosperity. Just kind of a note of biography. I was a freshman in college in Manhattan at the time. I had newly arrived from South Dakota. I knew next to nothing about Middle East or Islam. I certainly didn't know anything about the history of Afghanistan or American involvement in the region, or anything about the kind of growing tide of Islamist politics, or even the internal shifts that had revolutionized the practice of jihad over the last several decades. Now, people obviously wanted answers to explain the attacks, and soon this entire industry had grown up around the demand. There were academic takes mixed in that tried to offer greater nuance, but the dominant narrative very quickly became something like this. Jihad is a strange relic of this kind of medieval or barbaric past that's perpetuated by those who hate our freedom. Ours is consequently a clash of civilizations fought against an other who is the utter negation of everything the West represents. And the only proper response, once defined in these expansive and existential terms, was to wage a ruthless war on terror in all quarters of the globe. Only then would Americans truly be safe. Now, just because these tropes are tired and easily repudiated has not really lessened their appeal, and it's still quite common to find pundits bemoaning the supposedly medieval quality of jihad or the anti-Western nature of Islam more generally, or claiming that the US can only achieve broad-based security through more and more state violence, both at home and abroad. So this book is my attempt to intervene in this conversation and to tell a different kind of story, not about the barbarians at the gate and how, quote unquote, they are so much unlike us, but rather the strange ways in which today's jihad is a microcosm of global political and social trends that are remaking life in the West as well. So here I advance kind of two broad and overlapping arguments, kind of stemming, really coming from the fields of history on the one hand and political and social theory on the other. First is that jihad is not a singular phenomenon that assumes the same form over time, such that the ISIS jihad is not the same as the Bosnian jihad in the early 1990s, which is itself very different than the one declared by the Ottoman Empire in 1914, which likewise differs from medieval declarations of jihad during the Crusades. So recognizing jihad as a diverse and historically evolving practice makes it possible to cast aside the biggest misconception in the West, namely that it is an instantiation of medieval barbarism left over from a less enlightened time. On the contrary, and this is the second thing, I've come to the conclusion that should be far more unsettling, namely that today's jihad, at least in its Islamic State guise, is a hyper-modern phenomenon that has a great deal to teach us, not only about the past, but about a possible future. Why do I say that? Well, whether we look to the way that the individual is fetishized, the way that digital media is adopted to forge new types of global community, the allure of conspiratorial thinking, the view of governance as management, the elevation of violence as the premier form of civic agency, in all of these realms, contemporary jihad reveals much of what is latent in the very political and social order that we take for granted. So that's just kind of a very brief little bit about the book. But in the interest in the interest of making our kind of conversation more kind of dialogical, I'm going to stop right here and ask Spencer and Asad what you guys want to pick up on, where we should go.
I want to say first, thank you to the Brooklyn Public Library. I'm a Brooklyn native. So that meant I grew up in Grand Army Plaza and my branch libraries. And so it is a very warming thing from my soul to speak to the Brooklyn Public Library. Thank you so much. And particularly to speak about a book that I think is important as well as wonderfully researched and written. As Susie says, her book is not telling a story about a nuance, it's telling a story about a category error. And it's something that I've encountered without necessarily having the historical breadth or even language to express as she has, and usually just sort of runs up on, saying to a lot of the Islamophobia industry, like, don't you think it's weird that people who don't speak Arabic and never thought about Islam before 9/11 should have solved a 1600-year-old religion? Like, don't you think that's weird? 1400, sorry, year-old religion. Don't you think that's weird? Because that is weird, and it's charlatanism from the start, but it's also, in its presentation of Islam as being not just a foreign object, culturally and civilizationally speaking, but antithetical to the West, that has been astonishingly normalized and influential. I remember doing a story for Wired magazine over 10 years ago in which documents from inside the FBI in their training material said exactly this, that they were teaching counterterrorism, young special agents in counterterrorism, that Islam itself is the problem inside the United States, not acts of violence that might have found, justification through a particularly, violent interpretation of Islam. And so, she's not writing. I don't think your book is really something that speaks to a kind of, academic argument. This is a deeply influential argument politically and culturally that has tremendous consequences for the lives and freedom and security of millions of people in the United States and beyond. And I'll leave it there, but I definitely want, since we agreed this was to be kind of a free-flowing conversation, both Susie and Asad have important thoughts on a meme that in our corners of the internet we like to refer to as vanilla ISIS. And I really want to encourage you guys to pick up on that, but don't, I'm not setting the agenda here.
So first of all, let me start by thanking the Brooklyn Public Library, for putting this event together. I too am a native Brooklynite, and I never thought a day would come, where I would be talking about jihad at the public library. So Sharia won, Muslims won. It's a wrap, America. Sorry about that. But thank you also, Susie, for inviting me as an early career writer to this panel and for valuing my thinking. And of course, Spencer, it's an honor to be on a panel with you. So full disclosure to the audience, the three of us had a long dinner this weekend, and we kept going on and on and on. So this discussion in many ways may end up going in a whole bunch of directions. So please forgive us for that if it does, but do keep track of some of the points that we're making. I think Spencer brought up a crucial point about vanilla ISIS, and I do want to start from there because, being of Muslim background and growing up in Brooklyn, New York, where we have one of the largest, I think the largest Muslim community in the United States, overwhelmingly working class, and in many ways had to deal with the brunt of, the aftermath of 9/11. These are questions that I've been thinking about for a very long time. When I was an undergrad, as Joel mentioned in the introductory bio, I co-founded a charity called MGB, Muslims Giving Back. And the idea was essentially for a bunch of us young, Muslim teens to come together and deliver groceries to undocumented and needy families in our community. It was like mutual aid before mutual aid became sort of the popular thing. And the organization was infiltrated by an informant on the premise and on the logic that we were essentially a radical cell. This was about a decade ago. If you Google my name, for those of you who haven't heard the story, you'll find a bunch of hits about the lawsuit. Skip over the Islamophobic stuff. Just go straight to the ACLU's website. And so the idea of the idea that the label of terrorism should be expanded, right, to quote unquote vanilla communities, right, is one that brings a lot of distress to me, because the implication here is that it should be accepted for Muslim communities, right? And just to give you an idea of what the markers of terrorism are, in 2007, the NYPD published something called the Radicalization Report. It was authored by someone named Mitchell Silber. He teaches at Columbia University, so he's still at work. And the Radicalization Report was a 40 to 50 page report, essentially detailing pre-criminal traits among Muslim populations. Anytime you hear the word pre-criminal, that's a red flag, right? What is a pre-criminal trait? If someone hasn't committed a crime, they're innocent. You don't judge based on some qualities of theirs that are pre-criminal traits. Well, what are these pre-criminal traits? Number one, attending the mosque. Number two, growing out your beard if you're a man. Number three, wearing a hijab if you're a woman. Number four, going sober, so not drinking, not smoking. Number five, discussing politics. So I would say that a significant, I check off all those boxes, right? Minus the hijab thing, of course, but a significant number of Muslims do. And these pre-criminal traits are traits that are exhibited by all practicing Muslims. And so to expand that to, quote unquote, white supremacist terror cells would mean to accept it for ourselves. And I think that's a significant issue. And the question was posed after the insurrection, and it really boggled my mind that we're still having these conversations. What do you think about that?
Well, I think two things. So one is that, Spencer, kind of to your just point, I'm going to get to vanilla ISIS in just a second, and I have like a lot to say there, but right, there is a profoundly anti-empirical basis to much of this kind of very Islamophobic, like writing, thinking, punditry about jihad. That can't seem to explain why, if Islam is a problem, or if people kind of wage jihad because of certain verses that have been in the Quran for like over 1400 years, then why this is a phenomenon of such scale starting in the 1980s and 1990s and continuing to the early decades of the 21st century, and not in like 1950 or like 1860 or right any number of times. You have certainly instances of jihad throughout the ages. It's not like it doesn't exist, but it certainly does not exist at any at the scale that it does right now. And this is something that we have really good empirical data on. And in my book, I reference Stanford University's Mapping Militant Organizations project, which has these maps essentially of militant groups and that have emerged in the Middle East and North Africa and other regions over the last several decades. And you see the same pattern in Central Asia, in North Africa, and in the Levant itself, whereas the kind of relative quiet of the 60s and 70s gives way in the 80s to this new wave of Islamic militant actors who then kind of supersede and then completely outnumber any sort of like leftist groups, which used to be the only kind of militant game in town. And just like this, sheer number of them, it's, like literally like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of groups. We don't have a parallel to this in earlier instances in Islamic history. So we can't just explain this by saying, oh, well, it's in the Quran, because like the texts actually are fairly stable, but the way people interpret them and the way people interact with them is the thing that changed. And that's a thing that we have to like actually use the historian's toolbox to look at, rather than just kind of falling back on, well, the text says X. So that's kind of the first thing. It's my great defense of empiricism and historical research, rather than assuming that this is the way that things have always been. The vanilla ISIS thing is kind of, it is so dicey, and for a few different reasons. And I have some thoughts about it. So the first is that I'm very wary, given the kind of liberal complicity with Islamophobia and the global war on terror, of expanding this definition, and particularly expanding the framework and the toolbox that of the global war on terror, and basically arguing that we need a domestic counterpart to it. Like, I'm not sure who surveying the legacy of the global war on terror looks at that as like a great success story that's in need of emulation here on the home front. So, I'm really kind of very wary of that part as well. And there's kind of a view here that any like political and social crisis, the way that we can solve it is by essentially throwing more tools of like state violence and coercion at the problem and hoping that someday something will stick. And this is really unfortunate, because there actually is something here to learn from, say, the Islamic State or from kind of jihadi groups when we're thinking about the American far right. It's just not the thing that most like pundits think it is. Sorry, it's not that there's this kind of like clear one-for-one correlation, and that we need a domestic war on terror to kind of correspond with the 401. Rather, what we see something, there are these very substantive points that actually link them that go well beyond, this notion that they're both kind of the enemy. So I'm also will just say that I'm like very wary here of these kind of pathological explanations for political violence, whether we think that the people that we're talking about, if they're evil incarnate, if they're kind of just religious fanatics or nut jobs or wackadoodles, any of these terms, right? Because I think that these terms and the recourse to pathology offers assurance that there's nothing fundamentally askew with the current political and social order. And therefore they stop far short of asking why it has proven so generative of reactionary forces on the global scale. So if far-right movements seem to be flourishing worldwide and there's these substantive points of commonality to link them, that's not because their adherents are quote unquote all crazy, but rather because they're symptomatic of something kind of fundamentally rotten in the world that neoliberalism has built.
Just to add to that,
yeah.
Susie, really quickly, coming from an Islamic studies perspective and having studied Islamic thought and classical Islamic texts, one of the interesting things about even the marketing, for this event and even how we frame the issue in saying that, well, we actually can't look to medieval political Islamic thought when trying to explain ISIS today. Well, let's say hypothetically we did look to medieval Islamic thought, right? Let's just grant that for a second. Well, medieval political Islamic thought was actually incredibly diverse, right? If you study the political tradition from the works of, if anyone's an Islamic studies nerd in here, right, you may have read Nizam al-Mulk, al-Mawardi, or Juwayni, Ibn Jama'a, Ibn Taymiyyah, huge figures who in many ways are responsible for writing the political treatises that Muslim scholars today still study from a confessional standpoint. If you read into them and there are translations available, you can see how chronologically they readjust the way that they conceptualize the legitimacy of the ruler and his relationship and his responsibilities towards the subject, right? In many ways, as a response to the political contingencies of their time, right? So even when we say that this, we shouldn't take recourse to medieval Islamic political thought, there's a point that, well, actually pre-modern Islam was in fact quite pluralistic, quite self-critical, and in many ways, because of the fact that it hadn't been captured by the modern nation state, offered opportunities for thinking about world making in ways that we don't have to think about it today, right? In ways that I suppose we aren't beholden to today, right? And that's something that that's been on my mind for a long time, because not just as a Muslim, but also thinking about our contemporary moment where post-COVID, the neoliberal paradigm it's been laid bare for all of us to see. We saw that the great equalizer actually was not in fact quite equal. Black and brown poor communities were impacted most by the virus, and to this very moment globally, right, the global vaccine apartheid. You see how these communities still don't have access to these vaccines, and it is precisely because of neoliberalism. And I want to flesh that out a little bit too, and hear what you guys think about it, because one thing that stood out to me, and I'm just gonna check in my notes. You wrote that colonialism of the global South, and in this context, the Middle East, prefigured neoliberalism. This is to say that the neoliberal politics that governs the United States and much of Europe today began first in the colonies, right? Where the idea is that the state power was utilized towards shielding private enterprise from accountability, right? In these post-colonial states, which this facilitated an anti-democratic politics as the norm. So, you look at places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, so on and so forth. They're governed by, dictators, strongmen, so on and so forth, many of whom have alliances and partnerships with the descendants of feudal lords, large corporate power, so on and so forth. And we're seeing much of that today with, the relationship between corporations like Amazon and Google and Meta and the government.
Well, that's kind of, you brought me right to like where I was leading with the vanilla ISIS thing, which is the thing that we can actually learn from these comparisons is much more substantive. It's about the kind of legitimation crisis that actually undergirds these movements and kind of gives rise to them, and that manifests in like a lot of different ways. On the one hand, right, it's this kind of desire for individual agency in the face of these interlocking systems of control, in the sense that like you don't actually have a voice and that everything is futile, right? There is this like allure that you too can make a difference, right? It's this desire for community in the face of atomization, which is the kind of experience, the social experience of many people. And really in like action in lieu of just kind of mere like talking it over, deliberation, or kind of like the slow moving wheels of democracy. And that and I think kind of one of the major things I've zeroed in on in some of this writing as well is the kind of elevation of violence as the like premier mode of civic participation, when other avenues for participation in the kind of polity have been largely hollowed out, very much on account of these kind of like neoliberal politics that you've described, Asad. Like violence actually has this outsized role. Like it is still the thing that you are allowed to do. It is actually the way that you enact your kind of civic agency. And so if there is something to like be learned here, it's actually that this kind of crisis of legitimacy is further advanced in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Central Asia, that the kind of colony in that sense like precedes the metropole. But that is a kind of dynamic, I think, that we are going to see. We see little like pieces of, right? We don't want to like be hyperbolic, right? America is not Egypt or Syria, but you see kind of pieces of this kind of almost like quasi-colonial relationship coming home to roost. And it kind of, the social effects of it are myriad, everything from kind of just like massive distrust of like government scientific authorities, we don't want to get vaccinated, conspiratorial thinking, to all the way to the rise of our kind of militant movements and conspiracy groups like QAnon. Wait, Spencer, I want to give you a chance to hop into your
Yeah, so you guys packed in a lot, so like most of my notes are now overtaken by events, but just to speak very quickly to one of Asad's points, when the West describes, notwithstanding your eloquent survey of what medieval Islamic thought actually was. When the West is calling Islam medieval, it's telling on itself, because for
good
the
point.
West, the medieval period is a period of backwardness. If
Great
you
point.
were in the certainly the 9th, 10th, the 11th, the 12th century in Europe, and you were an educated person and you were a forward-thinking person who we would understand now as cosmopolitan, you would want to live in the emirate of Cordoba. You would not want to live in Christian Europe. Similarly, if it's the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, right up until I guess let's cut it off at the 16th, giving the Renaissance its due. But if you were the same sort of scholarly person in Europe, the place you would want to live is Istanbul under Ottoman rule. The way the West has erased its experience of Islam is a really astonishing historical thing to see unfold. It is, of course, an important backdrop of the 1990s Balkan Wars that Susie alluded to. But one of the things that I feel like we shouldn't lose sight of is to understand why all of that was deployed throughout the War on Terror. And the point is to deny all of these points of commonality, both intellectual and quite material. It's not an accident, I think, that we start seeing this shift toward this very individualized, decentralized, reflection of state crisis in contemporary jihad, not just because of neoliberalism, but what, of course, is the root of neoliberalism, and that is the Cold War, the very violent soil out of which we grow neoliberalism is global anti-communism. And it was exceptionally valuable for global anti-communism, particularly around this 40, 45, 50-year period that we're discussing here, for Western intelligence agencies, along with the Pakistanis, along with the Saudis, along with the Israelis, who, of course, strengthened Hamas in order to weaken the PLO, which is its primary political adversary, to strengthen violent political Islam, which will become this nihilist phase that Susie talks about so eloquently in her book, because that suited the interests of global anti-communism, and specifically the American efforts against the Soviet Union in the proxy war in Afghanistan. As to the point about where we see the periphery anticipating the metropole, I have seen this with my own eyes in Iraq and Afghanistan. You see a state apparatus that defines its relationship with its citizenry as something entirely securitized and extractive. Ultimately, the functions of the state in both Iraq and Afghanistan, under both direct American occupation and then indirect American occupation, functioned in order to decimate the functions of the state that did not have to do with the provision of security. And it's not the provision of security for the people in these countries. It's the provision of security for the extractive elements of those countries' economies that the United States rendered unto itself. And there we see kind of an anticipation of what we would have in 2005 in New Orleans when Katrina hit, to the point where you would have like the very unsubtle presence of Blackwater contractors to backstop a security sector in crisis. And then you see that, of course, here in the United States, as Asad had said, very unequally, of course, during COVID and so many places elsewhere. I think there's a really appropriate observation from the poet and politician from Martinique, Aimé Césaire, who in 1950 wrote the following: people are surprised, they become indignant. They say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it'll pass. And they wait and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, but the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. And I think that is about as apt a description of the dynamic that we're talking about as any has ever been written, and perhaps the most eloquent, certainly that I've ever encountered.
I mean, there's something so like the idea that like ISIS or jihad in general, like right, Al-Qaeda before it is medieval, right there, this does some really important ideological work because it assures people that this belongs to some sort of other world, right? That and then you like start picking, you know, you start doing like the kind of like careful analysis I try to do in this book. You're like, well, except for everyone's like an engineer, has a degree in like business administration, and they like speak about individuals and the way that individuals move through the world in this way that like is unmistakably like Western and liberal and modern, that they think about kind of, you know, that they have a community that's facilitated by global media and digital communication that is structured along the lines of a global corporation. Like nothing really fits. Like the idea that this is like a medieval formation, and because it's much more disturbing to actually have to grapple with the fact that this is a product of our modernity, that like the kind of you know, kind of pick up on the great and famous line from Walter Benjamin, right, that there's no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. That barbarism and civilization might not be a binary state, but that there might actually be something barbaric about what we think about as the civilized world. And that is what I think contemporary jihad kind of lays bare. And that is so much more disturbing, frankly, than just saying that this is like a remnant of a less enlightened time.
You know, fun fact, now that Spencer mentioned the Cold War and Susie, you know, the quintessential modernity of jihad. And since this is a talk with the Brooklyn Public Library, did you all know that just a few decades ago, Brooklyn was actually the first place where Osama bin Laden's mentor, Abdullah Azzam, recruited potential jihadis in the Cold War. So if you go to downtown Brooklyn, right by Atlantic and 4th, there's a big masjid there, big mosque there, Masjid al-Farouq. Right next to it, Abdullah Azzam had essentially his recruitment center. And if you wanted to go sign up for jihad against the Soviets at the time, so this was the American approved jihad, all you had to really do was show up at a center, you know, attend the Friday prayers and express interest, and you'd be on an American paid flight to Afghanistan. That could only happen in modernity. That could only happen under the conditions of the modern world. That would never fly in a pre-modern Islamic context, right? Shortly thereafter, you know, post-Cold War, the Taliban had an office space in Queens. Michael Moore has a great interview with them in 1999 where he actually visits them in their office. If you YouTube it, you'll be able to find it. But it's really the quintessential modernity of these movements that I think is of crucial importance, because as Susie, you mentioned early on in the talk, is that the idea that ISIS is medieval, the idea that something is wrong with Islam or that Islam needs to liberalize or to reform still carries enormous purchase. You know, not just in policy and sort of think tank spaces, but sometimes even in universities, right? And we're living in a post-Edward Said academic context. It's been now 40 some years since he wrote his book. And yet still, when I get asked to speak on Islam, usually, you know, to give workshops or, you know, as a consultant, I'm always called to engage with the question of violence, right? I could be giving a talk at an institution about, and this actually did happen, about ritual prayer, right? What are the rituals of Muslims and how do they pray and what does prayer mean to them? And I'll be asked to answer a question about, well, you know, why do they throw gays off buildings, right? Or, you know, what's going on? You know, is it something in the Quran? And the way, and these are liberal spaces, mind you. These are not. This is not like rural Tennessee. This is Lower Manhattan. I'm talking about. And the fact that this discourse still carries purchase, to me is, why do you think that is? Right? What is it about it that even in otherwise educated spaces? Susie, I read your book concurrently with. To make last point, I read your book concurrently with another book about, I won't name the author, he's a colleague of mine, but it was about reason in Islam and how Islamic thought ought to, recover reason. And of course, reason, when one says reason, they're not talking about aql in pre-modern Islamic thought. They're talking about
Enlightenment reason,
post-enlightenment,
instrumental reason.
This
A lot of
instrumental reason
suspicion about that.
Yeah, it totally aligns with whatever the Enlightenment, philosophers thought, as if there was a natural teleology towards that. And it still focuses on ideology, right? And I think what distinguishes your book was that you decenter ideology, you decenter, these very essentialist claims, and you do it in such a way without sort of falling into a counter essentialism, right? This is my last point before I pass it off to Spencer, right? So the counter essentialism is the total opposite. It's, well, Islam is not violent, Islam is peaceful. And, there was a campaign, I tweeted about it today. It's called the My Jihad campaign, #MyJihad. I want to say circa 2012, 2013, where there were these ads by Pamela Geller in the New York City subway. I don't even remember what the ads were about, but something to do. Yeah, something to do with like the jihad coming to America. And so Muslims, and many of them, I might have been part of the campaign. I was 18 or 19 years old at the time. I don't even remember, but lots of professional Muslims countered with this My Jihad campaign. And in many ways, it felt like, obviously I'm from an insider from the community, so I'm critiquing my own community here as an insider and as someone who loves my community. But in many ways, it felt like a sort of counter-essentialism, right? A defensive posture where there wasn't a need for one, right? And as I think through it now, retrospectively, I'm coming to realize that we don't need to fall into that sort of counter-essentialism where Islam is peace and it's all peaches and cream, but rather thinking about Islam as Talal Asad writes, as a discursive tradition, right? As a set of discourses that relate conceptually to the past and to the future, but mediated in the present. And so Islam is neither peaceful nor violent, but Islam is how believers sort of contest Islam. Sorry, Spencer, I know you raised your hand a couple of times, so I'll pass this over to you.
No, I think that's you asked the question, why do we think that
Yes.
this binary keeps presenting itself? And I think it really is, it speaks to exactly the point that Susie raised, which is that the West essentializes itself in contradistinction to Islam, essentializes itself in such a way that it is civilization, and that other element, and that in order to be civilized, one must be westernized. You see elements of this often more explicitly expressed in France than in the United States, because the United States likes to use different language for us, but it's functionally the same concept. You mentioned those Pamela Geller ads. I have some, one of the things that fascinates me about Pamela Geller is just like in a way that anticipates Donald Trump. You really see, the veneer ripped off with someone like Geller. If for those who may not be familiar, this is one of the people who ginned up the so-called Ground Zero Mosque quote unquote scandal, and inclines constantly toward a deeply conspiratorial view of Islam. Among the things that she tried to put on like city buses and in the subway was the line, and this is supposed to be, for her organization, Stop Islamization of America. The line was, in a war between the civilized man and the savage, choose the
Savage.
civilized man. And if you look at the history of Western civilization, you're not going to have a very easy time picking out which of these sides is civilized. Like the amount of overwhelming barbarism that, like, not only is Western civilization, is Western heritage, but also forms the foundation for everything that you can see as valorous in Western heritage. It just shows the absurdity of building this this binary, this distinction into our ways of understanding this. And the last thing I'll say is that when I think it's Asad, your point about not doing this kind of like counter essentialization is really important, because from my reporting over the last 20 years, the striking things about the similarities between both violent religious fanatics is the real consistent ways in which you really see the easy applicability of either religious text or philosophical text in the hands of people to justify violence. One of the points that Susie's book brings out tremendously well is the ways in which both ISIS and the Islamophobia industry reads the Quran pretty much similarly, which is to say, hunt for the verses that can justify either committing violence or showing a civilizational proclivity for violence. You see this in Christian identity. You see this, frankly, in the ways in which the Jewish community, my community, does not reconcile, come to terms with, and then oppose the ways in which Zionist history is a history of violence.
So I have a bunch of different things I want to say in response. One is that, right, the kind of jumping back to Asad, something you said about kind of, decentering ideology. It's kind of like this tricky line that you want to walk, right? Because you don't want to just like cast everything people say aside as like, oh, that's just false consciousness or something. And there's, but that the task here, and this is where it like helps to be like a historian of religion, is to understand that the ideology in question is not stable over time. That often that there are, right, and you can literally trace this, as I do in the book, where you have these like very old theological concepts like takfir, like excommunication, or al-wala wal-bara, like kind of loyalty and disavowal, right? These things that did not mean what they do today, and the way that they have these like religious practices, ideologies are reinterpreted in dramatically novel ways by people who claim that they're doing nothing other than reading the pure intent of the text. And that kind of denial that something is an interpretation is really kind of fundamental to the way that this kind of works as a power play here, to say, oh no, that's not my interpretation, that's literally just what the text says, that's just what it demands. And kind of to Spencer, to your point, right, this is a very Protestant reading of Islamic texts at the end of the day, one that kind of wants to cast aside a lot of the kind of legal jurisprudence and kind of tradition of kind of commentary and hermeneutics as something that obfuscates the true meaning of the text, and that actually, because really the individual can just pick up and read in this way, which is itself like wholly modern, wholly novel, which depends on this whole series of shifts: expanded literacy, access to printing, the kind of decline of communities and communal spaces as the places that will kind of mediate religious messages. All of this stuff is inherent in the notion that one can just like pick up the Quran and read it for yourself and decide what it means and whether or not you're supposed to do jihad or not. And this is like a literal quote from a ISIS recruiting video that I cite in the book. But kind of the other thing I'll say is that, right, I at least view kind of like as a scholar who's not part of the community, it's like the ultimate humanizing gesture that I can extend is to allow people to be complex, to be contradictory, to just be human, right? To kind of get to your anti-essentialism point. Like, so I'm like very, very wary of the arguments of like that this is truly Islamic or this is not truly Islamic. Like, that is not my role to adjudicate. That is for people within the community. If they want to fight about that, then absolutely go to it, because I think religions are contested objects that in their, you know, phenomenon that manifest in every generation is things that people fight over what they mean. And that is totally like, that's not an aberration. That is the way that they operate. And that's the way that I think actually they grow, and that's how they maintain relevance in people's lives. So, you know, and kind of finally just kind of note on that, right? The logic of true Islam is exactly the same logic that ISIS advances when it says that, right, they are the true Muslims and everyone else is kind of outside the boundaries of true Islam. And we should note how also eerily kind of how that logic of like the true community and then the imposters is actually to the kind of this rhetoric that's grown on the American right to kind of real America, right? And then there's like the citizens who are not really Americans. I mean, you've seen them kind of really lean into this in certain kind of quarters on the right lately, that like most people in America are not really Americans. And that kind of essentialism is something that we should be kind of quite wary of in either context.
Just to bring this back really quick to the point earlier when we were discussing a post-January 6th pivot of the war on terror back to the United States on white supremacy, an idea that really only a liberal could love. You know, you really see that like come, you know, front and center, that the idea that what we should have learned from the last 20 years is to substitute a security solution for a political solution. The war on terror from the start was a mechanism that distinguished real Americans from conditional Americans, citizens who deserved the protection of the state and the rights that the state is allegedly predicated on preserving, to those who were seen internally as a threat, people like Assad's community. And the ways in which, once you establish that test, it's wildfire. There's no way to stop, you know, intellectually speaking, from encompassing more and more marginalized communities as the state finds itself on shakier social and economic foundations. So there's no real way of stopping that. It's an exceptionally dangerous thing. We should resist it with every fiber of our being. The only response to a war on terror politically, and now that I no longer work for any news agencies and none can fire me, I can say this outright. The only solution for a war on terror is total abolition, to break all of its tools, to reverse all of its authorizations and so forth. You know, it obviously won't happen this way, because white terrorism emerges from foundational aspects of America and sees its soldiers as patriots, restoring America rather than changing America into something else. So you won't actually see this happen. But we should not want a war on terror that decides it will criminalize association in white communities, that will take you know, punitive both prosecutorial, intelligence, and financial action against people who donate to right-wing or supposedly white identitarian politics. All of this is a mechanism that will drive incitement. People who commit acts of violence ought to pay for that violence. People who incite such violence have to pay a price politically. Yeah. But to use entirely security tools for this is the chronicle of a disaster foretold. And I just want to, before I hand this over to you guys, I think just we want to, you know, I think make sure we don't give short shrift to another important point that Susie's book highlights a lot in the similarities across communities when they engage in this kind of purifying, quote unquote, political violence, which is that very often, like, this is a crisis afflicting men who interpret this violence across serious gender lines. Like you saw a lot of cases with the so-called Islamic State of them sort of encouraging young men on the internet not to miss their chance to become men, to show that they would be men through committing acts of violence. And I think that's an exceptionally important point that too often gets overlooked as kind of incidental rather than central to the enterprise.
Can I just read you this one little quote, and then Asad, I want to hand it over to you. But this is from kind of Elizabeth Neumann, who is from DHS, and when she was testifying at the House Homeland Security Committee last spring after the insurrection. And I'm just reading. She says, when it comes to prevention, what we've learned is that law enforcement agencies aren't necessarily the best to do interventions. But then the conclusion is not that we need to pursue security. And I mean security in a much more expansive way than I think it's often spoken about in kind of like national security conversations through some sort of different means, but that we have to be patient as the Department of Homeland Security works to build more robust mechanisms to prevent, radicalization and extremism over the next 5 to 10 years. So it's like there's this emerging paradigm that involves recognizing that there are these deep rooted social problems that give rise to far right political formations, but then also suggest that they can be addressed without making any fundamental changes to the existing social and political order. And just more state coercion and more kind of security forces is the way that we will avoid making any broader changes. Yeah, Asad.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay, let me pick a thread in my mind to pick at. Well, going back to some of the previous points about Islam and religion and these ideas being contested, I do want to add that even the idea of, let's bring it back home, the idea of America is fundamentally contested, right? I mean, think about our contemporary moment, right? National conversations around race in particular, right? I mean, there's a lot of right-wing, an enormous amount of right-wing paranoia about it. But I mean, even among conscientious and critical people, there is, there's a rich debate taking place right now about the Constitution, right? What is the nature of the Constitution? And this is happening in left spaces, right? The idea of liberalism. Charles Mills, the late Charles Mills, for those of you who don't know him, strongly suggests looking him up. He probably the foremost scholar of race in America, one of the most critical scholars, but also someone who wanted to rehabilitate the liberal tradition, save it from itself. The 1619 Project, which is, very critical of the United States and its founding. But at the same time, if you read the essays, it believes in the power of America's redemption through Black struggle. This is all to say that, there is no teleology towards which to aspire, but rather liberation is a question of possibilities, right? It's a question of what can be possible. And we can only reach that point once we, as Susie and Spencer have both so eloquently done, historicize and contextualize and recognize the contingency of some of these developments. Going to the question of the DHS quote and ideas of security. This is an important question because we spent most of tonight problematizing categories and calling into question a lot of things that are taken for granted. But I want to poke both of your brains a little bit and pivot towards, well, how do we think about a positive conception of the good, right? What would that entail and what would that require? Because today, if you're following, the Catholic right, or the traditionalist right or integralist Catholics, many of them are talking about reviving the common good, right? And they're rooting their critiques of America and free market capital and corporate power in traditional Marxist language, right? Traditionally Marxist language, but the solution, right, the common good is very different, right? It's Catholic integralist, which for those who don't know, integralism essentially, breaking it down very simply, the political and the theological are not seen as distinct, and the idea is to integrate them into one, right? And so, what would a left common good look like, right? Or a liberation-oriented common good, one that affirms the dignity of all people. And how would we even go? Like, what would, I know you touch upon this in your book, Susie, your book is not as prescriptive as you wanted it to be. I know you wrote that, but I would be curious as to like what would be the starting point for that.
So I think first is like right, like I'm interested in like reclaiming this term security from like the national security establishment and
Yes.
saying that, yeah, actually that's something that we should aspire toward. Absolutely, right? Who like doesn't want security, but what does that actually mean in practice? Right, security is has to be thought of in terms that are, I think, far more capacious than usually on offer. And and it's not like hard to see what security is. You go to like a wealthy neighborhood in the suburb that has like very like low rates of crime, etc. It's like, well, these people have an enormous amount of resources. These sort of people have homes, these people have food, these people have opportunities, these people feel like they have some sort of like voice, place, community, etc. Like I think all of those things are actually kind of quite integral building blocks to security. And part of the problem is that the US has kind of fallen into what some political scientists describe as a security trap, whereas the constant pursuit of security through force undermines all of the kind of political and social bases that are required for real broad-based, robust security that can be experienced kind of across the board. And I would say that the other kind of piece about this, which gives me pause, is that I think the pursuit of security is also one that's incredibly privatized. And as such, it is experienced in this like really differentiated ways. What do I mean by that? Well, it's right, not just in terms of, I track a lot of the kind of the privatization of war overall and kind of the rise of military contractors and such, but it's also like the private security details that, like people have guarding these like, guarding the gated compounds of, ultra wealthy people. It's the kind of private security systems, the like this whole kind of cadre of this whole industry of kind of private and personal security that grows up around people who can pay for it. The example I also give in my book is like the Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, who had their own private firefighters to spare their home from the 2018 California wildfires, which is an anecdote that my colleague at Brooklyn Institute, Ajay Singh Chaudhary, brought to my attention. But like, that's it, right? This kind of real, like almost like neo-feudal sort of system where security is not a public good that you have access to on account of being a kind of citizen of a place or a resident of a place, but something that's only available on the marketplace to those who can afford to pay for it. And so you have a kind of the shifting dynamic where you have an obsession with security kind of on the inside of the kind of the gilded compound with the deterioration of conditions outside. Right, COVID-19 was a perfect example of this in terms of you have people who like never have to leave their house. Everything can be delivered for them. All their they can work from home if they have jobs, sort of so on and so forth. And then you have this kind of mass of like precarious laborers on the outside doing this quote unquote essential work, literally kind of putting their lives on the line. So I think we have to, again, one, think more capaciously about security, and two, think about it in a way that would allow things like risk to be like shared collectively and mitigated collectively, rather than just shifted onto those who are kind of have the less advantage or less kind of structural advantage.
I would add to that only that, and I believe it's such a necessary point that we take the concept of security back from the national security state. As probably the participant in this discussion who has spent the most time with the national security state, with its practitioners, with the one who's on its listservs and so forth, like this community is deeply messed up, and messed up in all of the ways that like demonstrates all of the failures of the war on terror, not just conceptually, but from the perspective of believing that a war on terror is a valorous enterprise. What do I mean by that? I mean that in the United States, a very consistent feature throughout our entire history is refusing to recognize that material actions taken by the United States, and particularly taken by its elites, fuel security crises, lead to them directly. It is very significant that one of the first real acts of public, shall we say, censorship after 9/11 was the demonization of Susan Sontag for suggesting that 9/11 did not emerge because a bunch of people who are medieval religious fanatics living in caves hate the concept of freedom, but because American imperial action to decide for itself that America has the right to police the globe, and in particular, take exceptionally violent and economically harmful measures against entire populations in the Middle East, would have the effect of prompting violence by people who are inclined to see religion as justification for violence. These are material circumstances that we have to understand that after 9/11, we responded to not by alleviating, but by accelerating. And that real security will come only with the, I don't really know a good term for this, but only with the deconstruction, restriction, abolition of American global hegemony. That while that doesn't mean that American global hegemony is the only problem leading to global violence, it's a driver of it. It's a driver of it because the same thing that we talk about when we talk about American global hegemony is what American global hegemony is for, which is for unrestricted capital domination. Once that can be confronted, then we have a viable path toward providing security for human beings, not just in the United States, but around the globe. I think that one of the most important acts of solidarity that Americans can show with people around the world, particularly right now, is if we take it upon ourselves to force our politicians to abolish the war on terror, a war that we have to recognize for this conversation has, by the accounting, the very conservative accounting of the Brown University Costs of War Project, killed 939,000 people.
Asad, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, there's a quote, that speaks to, in the book, that speaks to these questions. And I think maybe after that, we can take some questions in the chat. I'm just going to quote you, Susie. Quote, if instead of treating mujahideen as evil incarnate, we regard them as individuals seeking agency, community, and meaning in a world that is short on all three, it becomes clear that tackling the conditions that produce them requires change that are both sweeping and rather basic. How do we build and sustain robust communities without abandoning a commitment to individual freedom? How do we create governments that are strong because they are truly responsive to the needs of their people? How do we revitalize some sense of the common good against which private gains must be weighed? How do we extend our powers of imagination such that a better world is possible, not just at history's end, but in its still unfolding present and future? This is on page 235, end quote. I think this is one of my favorite quotes and passages in the book, because in many ways it reminded me about, taking these questions about security to the local level. And in many ways it reminded me about my own local community here in New York City. And, both of you were in New York, after 9/11, but also after the 2011 AP revelations that there was a clandestine surveillance operation going on in the Muslim community. Personally speaking, when the informant who had infiltrated my friend circle and my organization publicly confessed to being an informant, there was a lot of fear and a lot of trauma. It was almost, and I was 18 or 19 years old at the time. And so for me, it shook my world. But what kept me afloat and what made me feel safe was knowing that I have a large community behind me. So when we started the lawsuit against the police, it was off to a shaky start. But at the end, when we secured the policy gains, 4 or 5 years later, at the end of my undergraduate career, there had never been a point in my life where I thought that I would feel this good about myself. And it was because of the fact that community was surrounding me. Today, the organization, which started off as a charity of a bunch of 18-year-olds pitching in $10 to buy groceries, operates out of a community center in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. We have what we call a hunger truck. So it's a $70,000 truck that we own with a built-in kitchen that every other day goes to deliver food to families all across New York City. We have youth and adult programs every other week or every week now that restrictions have been lifted. And the community has grown immensely, right? And that is what has brought safety to our people, right? That is what has brought security and comfort to us, right? That's not to sidestep questions of sovereignty and political power, because these are important questions as well. But I think as a starting point, working from the ground up is, in my experience, the best way to build the kind of world that we want to see, right? And the world that Susie alludes to. I do think we should, take questions as a number of them. Okay.
Yeah, who wants to
I'm scanning the chat. I see that we have a Michelle has a question about Egypt.
Okay.
Do you want me to speak to that?
do you want to read that out?
So it says, I'd love to hear this group's thinking on the current administration's relationship with Egypt. Having ran on the whole
Loan. I think that's supposed to be loan.
loan more blank checks and the human rights at the center of policy. Muslim Brotherhood was many things, including non-democratic when Morsi was president. However, the massacre at Rabaa, death sentences and secular activists in society shut down. Biden administration continues to support it. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is this was a wholly predictable. No more blank checks. Thanks you, Michelle.
Okay.
I like know there was U.S. support for the coup. Like this is Spencer and Asad. This is the story I didn't get to tell at our dinner. Like I had like someone who worked in the Egyptian embassy for the U.S. who was like fairly high ranking tell me that he thought the coup was an absolutely good idea and that there was like there was official support for it. So
John Kerry would, as Secretary of State, would not call it a coup. And then rather rapidly to consolidate Sisi's position after throwing Morsi in jail, returned U.S. military aid to the Egyptians. This is how coups work, right?
So,
like this
there's obviously a huge suspicion of the kind of Muslim Brotherhood of any sort of kind of like Islamist kind of politics, at least of a certain type. Right, we shouldn't lose sight of the kind of the allies in the Gulf, for instance, which are certainly no less like Islamist, if we're going to use that term, than the Muslim Brotherhood, but are kind of they're the forces of kind of conservative, like old school, like religious aristocracy and a kind of monarchical authoritarianism. And the Egyptian Brotherhood is a mass movement. It was actually kind of destabilizing to some of those powers. And I think actually beyond the kind of, I think the concern whether it was real or not for kind of women or religious minorities or any number of kind of groups that are kind of trotted out. I think it's like really at the end of the day, this largely boils down to a concern for capital in these countries, and which are the Islamists that you can that will play ball with capital, and which are the ones that might be a threat to it because they're actually broadly based and might have some sort of redistributionist aims. And that Sisi kind of is, he fits well within the kind of new emerging kind of pantheon of global strongmen who are kind of team authoritarian capitalism, which is very much the kind of place that I see us heading, which is that there's kind of this long association of capitalism with democracy. And I think a kind of,
democracy,
but of a certain type, which really means the freedom of the market. And even if you read, kind of some of the classic like neoliberal thinkers like Friedman, like Hayek, they will recognize that actually these two things don't necessarily have to go with one another. And that there may actually be a tension inherent in that relationship. And I think that that is something that is kind of broadly felt now, and then like, oh, actually we can have capitalism without democracy. Actually, it's even better if we have it without democracy, because then any gains are not going to be subject to the redistributionist aim of a mass political movement. Right, that it actually is, it works better to have it as an anti-democratic system, and that the Egyptian government, like many other kind of like Erdogan in Turkey, like governments in the Gulf, they can play ball with that, and thus have the kind of support of the U.S. in this kind of quest for quote unquote regional stability. Yeah, Spencer.
it's sort of a stripping off of the veneer, right? Because capitalism, in fact, is anti-democratic. What it has as a virtue during the Cold War for legitimating itself was its entrenchment within formal democracies, at least countries that had a republican structure that were, predicated in some liberal sense on the consent of the governed and so forth, but in truth operated to hold back the advance of democracy. It is foolish, I think, to talk about democracy in a circumstance where you do not have economic democracy. That just sort of doesn't work together. And what we're seeing with increasing rapidity over the last several years, but building steam over this 45 or so year age of neoliberalism, is now like reaching the something of an inflection point where capital recognizes that the crisis that it faces politically is such that maintaining a formal relationship with democracy is no longer necessary. In fact, perhaps no longer desirable. This is the meaning of what's happening, not just in Egypt, but with the conservative turn toward Orban in Hungary that's gotten a lot of attention. And, we shouldn't be surprised for a moment that the Biden administration would look toward.
Oh no, Spencer.
Is that me or is that Spencer?
I don't know.
I think it's Spencer.
Oh no.
Did I cut out?
Yeah.
Little
Now
bit, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, I'll.
You're gonna stop because your connection.
Okay, well, he stopped. We'll give him a second. But we also have, just because we're
You
on
should
short,
not get rid of Hosni Mubarak.
Spencer, I think you're cutting on and off.
Hi, sorry. Why don't you guys go? If you can,
Okay.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You guys go. Sorry.
Asad, go ahead.
One thing I can recommend, just for the lag thing, try turning off your video for a couple seconds to bring you up to speed. It usually works for me, if that's okay with the organizers. Just to check for time, I know we're falling a little short, and Anne asked a number of questions, so I want to get to that, and then we can go to the Andrew and Nadia as well. So Anne asks, oh, this one's for Spencer. Spencer, you asked a key rhetorical question. I forgot your exact words. Why do people, even in quote unquote liberal spaces, apply such different logic to Islam than to other religions and phenomena? Panelists, what is your answer to why? You know what mine is. A big factor is racism because Islam is racialized. Well, I'll say, yeah. One thing is, yeah, because Islam is racialized, but also because I think oftentimes criticism of Islam and Muslim communities it's so easily co-opted by right-wing and reactionary discourse that people won't, people will shy away from criticizing because they may not have the language or tools to do it in a way where like it doesn't get co-opted. And that's a difficult thing to do. And I've had allies come to me and ask me these questions, and I said, look, Islamophobia, Islamophilia, there's a middle way, and that middle way is treating and talking to people like they're normal, as Susie said earlier. So that's probably why I think is the case. People don't want to. Muslims are as it stands in the current sort of social hierarchy, a protected category. That might change as Muslim communities assimilate, and you're starting to see some of that in terms of an emerging Muslim neo-traditionalism that is aligning itself with right-wing phenomena and right-wing ideas. And that's a separate discussion of its own. But if Susie and Spencer want to take the question, by all means.
I mean, I'll just say that there is this, I'm teaching right now our Brooklyn Institute's class on Edward Said, and we read Orientalism as part of that class. And one of my favorite kind of definitions or kind of critiques of Orientalism is just this like profoundly anti-empirical practice. It's lazy. It's like really bad scholarship. It's beyond the kind of other problems that we know. And why do I say that? I mean that there's a impulse there that, like, rather than having to do the legwork of kind of history, of sociology, of economics, of any of these disciplines, we can just go to a text. We can even go to a text that's like 14 plus 100 years old, and we can open it and we can imagine that everything that's happened in Muslim communities ever since is somehow like here. It's in this kind of, all of it is kind of seated here in the Quran. And if only we can decipher it, then everything else kind of makes sense. And yes, this is like a bonkers idea to have about kind of people or culture, but I want to note that it's not just, I think that it's racist, but that it kind of and really essentialist. But it comes from this like profoundly idealist, and I'm using this in like a Hegelian sense, idea that, right, that the that just by like studying these texts and seeing what these ideas are, then we can explain everything about people, and it obviates the work, which is just like, it's a lot harder, right? It's a lot harder to dig into all of the history and the economics and all of this stuff and think about imperialism, thinking about agency and subjectivity and all of these things, than to say, oh, but the Quran says X is your, you know, and I still think that that logic of Orientalism kind of holds a lot of sway over the way that we particularly deal with cultures that we might deem as foreign, and the way that we assimilate them.
I would just say to Anne's question, I think liberalism is sort of inextricably parochialist, that it doesn't see outside of itself extremely well, and that it likes to define itself in opposition, both to, quote unquote, foreign phenomena and to religious phenomena, that it sees itself in contradistinction to these things, and in proximity, particularly after 9/11, treating Islam exceptionally was a way to deny the violence that liberalism both exists within and more often than not justifies.
So the second question that Anne asks, she says, as Brooklynites and New Yorkers born and adopted, you touched on Abdullah Azam on Atlantic Avenue and on the Ground Zero Mosque, quote unquote. Can you address the significance of the 9/11 attacks happening in NYC itself, and specifically downtown, not just hitting the financial sector, but directly and personally terrorizing a major left-leaning cultural center of the US, Lower Manhattan? How, if at all, do you think that has affected discourse and reactions? I have a law professor relative who says that OBL might not have done it on purpose, but it was a genius move because it readied a sector who might have been skeptical of a security surveillance response to be terrified/angry. Does anyone want to take that first?
I'll go quick. It goes to the last section. There was, for a long time during the War on Terror, probably the greatest exponent of this was Christopher Hitchens. There was a relentless effort to say that Islam threatened cosmopolitanism, that Islam was a threat to the open society. In truth, the open society can only be threatened by state action. And by defining Islam as anti-cosmopolitan, that enlists liberalism in the fight against it, because liberalism exists supposedly to advance the causes of cosmopolitanism and the open society. And to see New York City attacked, understood. You say left-leaning. I know what you mean. I have too much familiarity with New York City to believe that that is the prevailing interpretation of New York. I know what you mean, though. The effect of the attack in important ways was not to have New Yorkers seen as people under attack, but to galvanize different New Yorkers against other New Yorkers, who nevertheless, as all New Yorkers, felt the very real trauma of 9/11.
Right. If you see something, say something, right? And see something typically meant, if you see a brown person, and it could be
if you see someone.
Right.
I mean, can I just say also, I mean, certainly, yes, there's association with New York, with kind of like the kind of a liberal kind of cosmopolitanism. And Spencer, you're totally right, and this like carries through to today. Like, like, right, people like Bill Maher who like fashion themselves as liberals and are just absolute Islamophobes when it comes to at the end of the day, right, that became like a respectable liberal position to uphold, because if you were in favor of secularism, if you were in favor of women's rights, and you were in favor of democracy, then seemingly you had to like oppose Islam suddenly. But the other thing I was going to mention is, of course, right, it's not just like anything in New York. It's like the World Trade Center, the kind of, the center of kind of commerce and finance. And remember that bin Laden himself is like quite critical of capital in this like very, very, strange way. And I'm just going to read to you from my book here, right? He has this quote where he says, "This greatest of plagues and most dangerous threat to the lives of humans is taking place in an accelerating fashion as the world is being dominated by the democratic system, which confirms its massive failure to protect humans and their interests from the greed and avarice of the major corporations and their representatives. And despite this brazen attack on the people, the leaders of the West still talk about freedom and human rights with a flagrant disregard for the intellect of human beings. This is what I tell you. As you liberated yourselves before from the slavery of monks, kings, and feudalism, you should today liberate yourself from the deception, shackles, and attrition of the capitalist system. If you were to ponder it well, you would find that in the end, it is a system harsher and fiercer than your systems in the Middle Ages." And in bin Laden's
That's
telling,
bin Laden?
that's bin Laden, but in his telling, that's actually why we should not have democracy, because he sees democracy as the engine of capitalism. Not that the two might actually exist in some sort of tension as we do, but rather right there kind of, I mean, he's like basically echoing like the Washington consensus that these two systems go along with one another. And it is democracy, and it's the spread of democracy that allows the spread of capital. And capital is this kind of degrading system that is like destroying human life on the planet. He talks about climate change. He talks about, yes, corporate greed, so on and so forth. Right. The kind of like the tragic flaw in the thinking here is not understanding that these two things are actually quite distinct and in some ways in a huge amount of tension. But so like the targeting of a specifically like financial institution, though, I think is also key.
I just want to say, sorry, Asad, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we'd have to wind down with the last question, but make your point.
Just real quick. Yeah. It's really a risible statement from Osama bin Laden, the billionaire. Osama bin Laden must be understood as a billionaire doing an extreme version of what billionaires always do, which is play with people's lives. The justifications that Osama bin Laden can make for his mass murder are whatever they say is, but whatever he wants to put forward. But that doesn't mean while we can take the substance of what he says seriously, we also are under no obligation to give this billionaire any more credence than we would any other billionaire in such
I love it.
Bin Laden and Bezos are in the same billionaires club. But I think we have a minute or two left, so we're going to have to be very quick with this one. These questions look like they're more suitable for Spencer and Susie, respectively.
There was one question about like the internet, which maybe is something that we can talk about. Did you see that one?
Yeah, so I'm going to read that one first. I'd love to hear whether members of this panel believe there's a way for global connectivity facilitated by the internet to coexist with a much more humane and meaningful interpretation of security, not in a theoretical vacuum, but coming out of our material conditions. The national security state has its hands so deeply in the internet. Can the kind of community Asad described ever coexist, transcend, or compete with the presence of the state? And for that matter, massive corporations and digital information channels. And it connects to the next question. Does this panel foresee authoritarian capitalism emerging or arriving in the US? So I'll let y'all take that one.
When you look at the way the internet is constructed, only the answer just is no. That the forces that control the internet are powered by a logic known as surveillance capitalism. There's an excellent book by the Harvard Business School professor emerita Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism that addresses this question far better than I could. I would only say that only if collective action is taken by some sort of democratically accountable supranational body that does not exist today to declare the internet a global commons and then police it as such, as well to require that each of us have a right to own the data that we generate. Then and only then could we break a surveillance capitalist paradigm and approach the global community that I think your question is kind of aiming at.
Yeah, I mean, I second all of that and would just say that, right, that we have to, I think we do have to think kind of, right, like a little bit like, we have to think about these things as, yes, the internet is this thing that facilitates this, its current iterations facilitate exactly the type of surveillance capitalism that Spencer is talking about. But this is actually technology that is like, shouldn't just be like rejected, right, outright for that. It also facilitates all sorts of communications between people on a kind of, across the world, and more and a solidaristic kind of models as well, right? Like those possibilities are present in this same technology, but it would have to be kind of developed and managed in an entirely different way than it has been. But like this also gives us the possibility of forging these kind of real, truly international connections that I think are actually quite necessary for the 21st century.
A better world is possible.
We hope.
We can build it.
Inshallah.
We don't have to hope.
Inshallah.
I think that's it for us, right?
Yeah, I
that
think so.
Seems like a great place to stop. What an amazing conversation. I'm not spotlighted, so you can only hear me, but it was a great pleasure to listen in on the three of you, and I congratulate you again, Susie, on your book. And to all of the folks at home and on the live stream, thanks so much for being here. Spencer, Asad, Susie, great to hear from you, and come back next time. And good to see everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye.